In his book, The Power of Habit, journalist Charles Duhigg embarks on an investigation into the science of habit formation, a force that operates beneath our conscious awareness, yet directs a substantial portion of our daily actions. To begin, we must first appreciate the profound separation between our conscious mind and the mechanisms of habit, a divide most starkly illustrated in individuals whose memory has been lost. The experience of Eugene Pauly, a man who, due to viral encephalitis, was left with near total amnesia, illustrates this divide. He could not retain new information for more than a minute. He couldn't tell you what day it was, who the president was, or even map the layout of his own home. Yet a researcher named Larry Squire discovered something remarkable. Every morning, Eugene's wife would take him for a walk around the block. One day when she was inside, Eugene walked out the front door and disappeared. His wife, Beverly, was panicked, but a short time later, he walked back in. He had no memory of where he had been or what he had done. When it happened again, Beverly followed him. She watched as Eugene, a man who could not draw a map of his own hallway, perfectly navigated his neighborhood block, turning at the correct intersections and avoiding obstacles. He was following a route purely from habit. Neurological scans revealed the source of this disconnect. The virus had destroyed his hippocampus, the brain region critical for forming new long-term memories. But his basal ganglia, a primitive structure deep within the brain, was perfectly intact. This ancient piece of neurology, which also controls automatic functions like breathing and swallowing, is where habits are stored. Eugene's case provides the foundational evidence that habits are not memories. Habits, therefore, are not a failure of memory or discipline, but a distinct and potent cognitive function operating on its own set of rules. If these behaviors operate outside of conscious memory, we must then ask what specific neurological mechanism governs their function. A clear blueprint emerged from research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the 1990s. Scientists implanted microsensors in the brains of rats and had them navigate a simple T-shaped maze for a chocolate reward. Initially, a rat's brain was a flurry of activity throughout the entire run. It was sniffing, scratching, and processing new information. But after dozens of repetitions, a significant change occurred. Mental activity quieted down almost completely during the run itself. Instead, brain scans showed two sharp spikes of intense neurological activity, one at the very beginning and one at the very end. The act of running the maze had become neurologically quiet, almost effortless. This experiment allowed scientists to isolate and define the habit loop, the fundamental architecture of every habit. The loop begins with a cue, which is the trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode and which habit to use. For the rat, it was a loud click. This is followed by the routine, the physical, mental, or emotional behavior that is performed. For the rat, this was running the maze. Finally, there is the reward, the positive stimulus that tells your brain this particular loop is worth remembering for the future. For the rat, this was the chocolate. This three-step process is an evolutionary feature designed to conserve effort. By converting a sequence of actions into an automatic routine, the basal ganglia allows the more advanced parts of our brain to power down, freeing up mental energy for novel problems. This is why you can perform complex routines, like backing a car out of a driveway, while thinking about something else entirely. Yet understanding this three-part structure does not fully explain its propulsive force. For that, we must look at the neurochemical anticipation of the reward. The loop isn't just a mechanical process. It is driven by a powerful neurological desire. This deeper layer was uncovered by the work of neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz. His research revealed that craving is rooted in the neurochemical dopamine, which is associated with pleasure. In a key experiment, a monkey named Julio was trained to pull a lever for a juice reward. Initially, the dopamine spike occurred upon receiving the juice, but as the habit formed, a shift occurred. The spike no longer happened when Julio received the juice. Instead, it occurred the moment he saw the shape on the screen, the cue. The brain wasn't celebrating the reward itself, it was celebrating the anticipation of it. This neurological shift is the birth of a craving. The brain has learned to anticipate the reward so powerfully that the cue alone is enough to trigger the pleasure centers. This craving is what makes the habit loop self-perpetuating. It's the reason the smell of coffee can send you walking toward a cafe, Or the notification sound on your phone can create an almost irresistible urge to check it. The routine is performed not just to get the reward, but to satisfy the craving that the cue has initiated. Without this craving, the habit loop is a weak, lifeless construct. With it, it becomes a potent, self-reinforcing cycle of neurological anticipation and response. The craving is the engine of the habit. Recognizing that this loop is powered by craving leads directly to the primary principle for its modification. If you want to change a habit, you cannot simply extinguish it. The neurological pathways are too deeply ingrained. Instead, you must repurpose the existing loop. This insight is formalized as the golden rule of habit change, which operates by targeting the central component of that three-part neurological sequence we examined earlier. To alter a habit, you must keep the old cue and deliver the old reward, but insert a new routine. The efficacy of this principle is demonstrated most powerfully by the structure of Alcoholics Anonymous. AA is one of the most successful behavior change programs in history, and its methodology aligns perfectly with the golden rule. It recognizes that people drink in response to specific cues: stress, loneliness, anxiety. The reward they seek is often relief or companionship. AA does not attempt to eliminate these cues from a person's life. Instead, it provides a new routine. When an alcoholic feels the urge to drink, the cue, they are instructed to call their sponsor or go to a meeting, the new routine. This action provides a similar reward: the companionship of the group and the relief of sharing their struggle. The cue and reward remain the same, but the routine is fundamentally altered. This principle of substituting the routine is not limited to recovery programs. It is equally effective in high-performance environments like professional sports. Tony Dungy, a former NFL coach, transformed struggling teams by focusing on changing players' on-field habits. He didn't ask his players to make better split-second decisions. Instead, he drilled them relentlessly on a few key responses to specific cues, teaching them to react with a new, simplified set of movements. He made his players faster and more effective, not by making them think more, but by making them think less and rely on superior habits. While the golden rule provides a method for changing a single behavior, certain habits possess a disproportionate influence over our entire system of routines. These are what Duhigg identifies as keystone habits. A keystone habit is a single practice that, when adopted, triggers a cascade of other positive changes, reshaping unrelated patterns in its wake. The logic is one of leverage. Changing a keystone habit creates a new structure that makes other changes easier. To understand keystone habits in action, we must turn to the transformation of the aluminum giant Alcoa under CEO Paul O'Neill in the late 1980s. On his first day, O'Neill announced to investors that his primary focus would be on improving worker safety, aiming for zero injuries. Wall Street was baffled, but O'Neill understood that safety was a keystone. To achieve zero injuries, the company had to understand why injuries were happening. This required a radical overhaul of communication. A unit president had to report any injury to O'Neill within 24 hours and present a plan to ensure it never happened again. This forced managers from different levels and departments to communicate constantly. The old rigid hierarchy dissolved. As communication improved and processes were streamlined to be safer, they also became more efficient. Quality went up and costs went down. The singular focus on this one keystone habit rebuilt Alcoa's entire corporate culture. When he retired, the company's annual net income was 5 times higher than when he started. A similar effect is observed on an individual level. Studies from institutions like the National Institutes of Health have shown that individuals who start a habit of regular exercise often begin to change other, unrelated behaviors. They start eating better, become more productive at work, and feel less stressed. The exercise itself provides a structure for small wins that makes other positive routines feel more attainable. If keystone habits can organically reshape our lives, it is also possible to intentionally engineer a new habit across an entire population by manufacturing its central component, the craving. The story of Pepsodent toothpaste in the early 20th century is a masterclass in the commercial application of the habit loop. At the time, only about 7% of Americans brushed their teeth. Dental hygiene was a national crisis. Then, An advertising executive named Claude Hopkins was tasked with marketing Pepsodent. He knew that to sell a product, he needed to create a habit. To do that, he needed a simple cue and a compelling reward. He found his cue in dental textbooks, the mucin plaque on teeth, which he rebranded as the film. His ads featured simple messages. Just run your tongue across your teeth. You'll feel a film. This cue was universal and impossible to ignore. Next, Hopkins needed a reward. The health benefit of preventing cavities was too abstract to create a daily craving. Pepsodent, however, contained ingredients that created a cool, tingling sensation. Hopkins began advertising this sensation as a sign of cleanliness and beauty. The reward wasn't long-term health, it was the immediate, tangible feeling of a clean mouth. He had successfully linked a universal cue, tooth film, to a new routine, brushing with Pepsodent, and a compelling reward, the tingling feeling. He manufactured a craving. Within a decade of his campaign launching, more than 65% of the American population brushed their teeth daily. The outcome was a national habit change, not from a new technology, but from a keen understanding of the habit loop. The successful installation of new habits, whether personal or commercial, often depends on another factor which itself behaves much like a habit: self-control. For decades, willpower was thought of as a skill. However, research suggests a different model. Willpower isn't a skill, it's a finite resource. Much like the strength in a muscle, it can be exhausted through use. Psychologist Mark Muraven's research demonstrates this principle of willpower depletion. In his experiments, participants first had to perform a task requiring self-control, like resisting freshly baked cookies while eating radishes. Afterward, they were given a difficult puzzle. The findings were stark. Those who had drained their willpower by resisting temptation gave up on the puzzle significantly faster than those who hadn't. This suggests willpower is a finite, measurable resource. Recognizing this dynamic, some organizations have developed systems to conserve their employees' willpower. Starbucks, for example, heavily trains its employees on how to handle difficult situations using a system called the Latte method. This pre-planned routine, listen, acknowledge, take action, thank, explain, provides a script for stressful moments. By drilling this method until it becomes an automatic habit, employees don't have to expend precious willpower figuring out how to respond. Their response becomes a low-energy habit, preserving their self-control for other demanding aspects of their job. They have turned willpower itself into a routine. Therefore, if willpower is a finite, drainable resource for an individual, it poses an even greater challenge at the scale of an organization. A company's collective self-control is only as strong as the systems it builds to conserve it. When these systems, these organizational habits, are flawed, the consequences extend far beyond a single person's bad day. Just as an organization can systematize willpower, its ingrained collective habits can also become a blueprint for systemic failure. Unexamined organizational routines, while often promoting efficiency, carry the risk of creating dangerous blind spots. The 1987 fire at the King's Cross Underground Station in London serves as a tragic example of this principle. The fire started small, but a collection of dysfunctional organizational habits allowed it to escalate into an inferno that claimed 31 lives. The official investigation uncovered not a single point of failure, but a culture of counterproductive routines. Ticket collectors had a habit of calling the station master for every problem, creating a bottleneck. In turn, station masters habitually downplayed these reports to avoid disturbing central command. This systemic failure in communication meant that by the time the fire brigade arrived, following their own routine for minor incidents, the disaster was already unstoppable. No single person or department had a holistic view of the situation. Each group was following its own ingrained procedures, which were designed for efficiency within their own silo, but were completely ineffective for interdepartmental crisis management. There was no overarching habit for communication or shared responsibility. The disaster at King's Cross was not the result of individual incompetence. It was the result of an organizational structure where deeply embedded routines prevented anyone from recognizing the true scale of the threat until it was far too late. The tragedy provides a stark warning that organizational habits, left unexamined, can have lethal consequences. While some organizational habits can lead to internal disaster, others are designed with surgical precision to influence behavior externally, often without the consumer's awareness. In the modern economy, data has become the raw material for understanding and shaping customer habits on a massive scale. The predictive analytics programs developed by corporations like Target represent a sophisticated application of the habit loop for commercial purposes. A decade ago, Target assigned a statistician named Andrew Pohl to identify pregnant customers, even in their first trimester, so the company could target them with promotions for baby-related products. Pohl's team sifted through the purchasing histories of women on Target's baby registry. They identified a cluster of 25 products that served as a powerful pregnancy predictor. Individually, items like unscented lotion or magnesium supplements are meaningless. In aggregate, however, they formed a clear, predictive pattern. Using this data, Target created a pregnancy prediction score for every female shopper. They could then send customized coupons for items like diapers and cribs at the precise moment a woman's buying habits were most malleable. The program was so accurate that it famously resulted in an incident where Target sent baby-related coupons to a teenage girl, angering her father, who called back later to apologize when he discovered his daughter was, in fact, pregnant. This case reveals how corporations can deconstruct consumer behavior into data points, identify the habit loops, and then use those insights to influence purchasing routines. The precision of such systems forces a critical question. When our routines are being decoded and shaped by external forces with such accuracy, where does our autonomy truly lie? This question moves the study of habits from a tool for personal improvement into a much larger conversation about modern life itself. Given that corporate and individual habits are so entrenched, they often require a significant external shock to create the conditions for change. Organizational routines are notoriously resistant to modification because they balance a complex web of internal power structures and organizational truths. Only a crisis, a moment of high-stakes disruption, can break this truce and create an opportunity for fundamental reform. Rhode Island Hospital in the early 2000s provides a compelling illustration. The hospital was plagued by a dysfunctional culture and some of the nation's worst malpractice rates. Nurses felt intimidated by doctors and were hesitant to speak up. Then, a series of high-profile, preventable surgical errors thrust the hospital into a full-blown public crisis. The negative press and loss of patient trust shattered the existing organizational truce. The old habits and hierarchies were no longer defensible. This moment of crisis allowed the hospital's leadership to introduce a radical new Keystone habit, the mandatory implementation of surgical checklists. Inspired by the aviation industry, these checklists forced every member of the surgical team to communicate at critical moments. Under normal circumstances, such a mandate would have been met with fierce resistance. But in the midst of a crisis, the need for a new, safer way of operating was undeniable. The checklist habit was adopted, and it fundamentally rewired the communication patterns within the operating room, leading to a significant improvement in patient outcomes. The crisis created the necessary leverage to install a life-saving organizational habit. Beyond responding to crises, industries have learned to manipulate our cognitive habits by packaging the novel within the familiar. Our brains are predisposed to like things that we have been exposed to before, a cognitive bias called the mere exposure effect. This is an especially useful principle in industries like music, where success depends on getting the public to embrace something new. Radio programmers and record labels have learned to engineer a hit song by making it feel familiar, even when it's not. The rise of the song Hey Ya by Outkast in 2003 is a prime example of this process. When Hey Ya was first released, it was musically unique, and initial tests with audiences were not promising. People found it jarring, so radio programmers began to strategically place Hey Ya in their playlists, sandwiching it between two hugely popular and well-established hit songs. The logic was rooted in brain science. When a listener heard a song they already knew and liked, their brain entered a state of comfortable engagement. By inserting the unfamiliar sound of Hey Ya immediately after this familiar trigger, the programmers leveraged the listener's existing positive state. The brain was more receptive to the new song because it was wrapped in the familiar. After repeated exposure in this context, Hey Ya started to sound less strange. It became an earworm and eventually one of the biggest songs of the decade. The industry didn't just release a song, it used our brain's preference for familiarity to manufacture a habit of listening to it. This capacity to package the unfamiliar within the familiar is not merely a commercial tool. It is a fundamental principle of social engineering. It reveals that the habits of a marketplace and the habits of a society are governed by the same deep-seated neurology of connection and trust. A force that can be harnessed not just to sell a product, but to spark a movement. This principle of familiarity and connection also dictates how societal-level habits form and spread. The success of a social movement often depends less on a single leader and more on the social habits of a community. Sociological research distinguishes between two types of social ties. Strong ties are the bonds we share with close friends and family, which motivate initial action. Weak ties are the connections we have with acquaintances, which are the bridges that allow behaviors to travel between different social clusters and sustain a movement through peer pressure. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 shows how these two types of ties work in concert. Rosa Parks' arrest was the catalyst, but the movement's success was rooted in the city's pre-existing social habits. Parks was deeply embedded in numerous social networks, and her strong ties caused news of her arrest to spread rapidly through trusted connections. This prompted the initial wave of support. However, what sustained the boycott for 381 days was the activation of weak ties, primarily through the city's black churches. The churches were the hubs of the community's social life. The weekly gatherings provided a platform for leaders to disseminate information and, critically, to exert peer pressure. Attending church and participating in the boycott became intertwined social habits. It became socially difficult not to participate. The movement became a self-propelling community habit, driven by the combination of strong ties that initiated it and the weak ties that scaled it. When a habit becomes so deeply embedded at a personal or societal level, it raises fundamental questions about agency and responsibility. The science of habit formation complicates our understanding of free will. If our behavior is automatic and triggered by external cues, where does conscious choice end and compulsion begin? This question moves from the laboratory into the courtroom in cases involving addiction. The legal defense of Angie Bachman, a homemaker from Iowa, brought this dilemma into sharp focus. Bachman developed a severe gambling habit and lost her entire life savings and a $1 million inheritance. She was eventually sued by Harrah's Casino for $500,000 in gambling debts. In her defense, Bachman's lawyers argued that she was not fully responsible. They presented evidence that the casino industry has meticulously designed its games to exploit the neurological habit loop. The lights and sounds serve as powerful cues, while the unpredictable payouts are engineered to maximize dopamine release and create an intense craving. Her lawyers contended that the casino, knowing the science of addiction, had created a product that, for some, effectively overrides their capacity for rational choice. The case posed a difficult question for the legal system. Does a scientifically engineered habit constitute a form of compulsion that mitigates personal culpability? While the court ultimately ruled against Bachman, her case highlights the profound ethical gray area created by our modern understanding of habits. It forces us to ask whether we are always the sole authors of our actions. The legal system's search for a clear line between choice and compulsion forces us back to the neurological root of how change is initiated. If our basal ganglia can execute complex routines without our conscious input, what does it take to intervene and rewrite those scripts? The answer appears to lie not just in the mechanics of the loop, but in a more abstract concept: belief. The power of belief is a critical and perhaps indispensable component of intentional habit change. We can see the stark absence of choice in phenomena like sleep terrors, a disorder where individuals can perform complex actions while completely unconscious. Their actions are driven by the most primitive parts of the brain, entirely divorced from their conscious will. This represents pure automaticity. On the other end of the spectrum is the process of deliberate change, as seen in recovery programs like Alcoholics Anonymous. Analysis of AA's methodology reveals that in addition to providing a new routine, a central element of its success is the requirement that members believe in a higher power. From a secular, scientific perspective, the specific nature of this higher power is less important than the act of believing itself. Studies on patients undergoing recovery have shown that the moment of belief, the conviction that they can change, is often a neurological turning point. This belief appears to be the catalyst that allows the prefrontal cortex, the seat of our conscious decision-making, to actively engage in the process of fighting the cravings generated by the basal ganglia. Belief, it seems, is the spark that gives us permission to start redesigning our own neurological loops. It is the component that makes free will operational. Therefore, a functional model for deliberate habit change must integrate the mechanical loop, an understanding of its underlying craving, and the conscious belief in one's ability to redirect it. This synthesis provides a practical framework for anyone seeking to become a more conscious architect of their own behaviors. This framework can be broken down into a four-step process. The author, Charles Duhigg, used this exact process to diagnose and alter his own daily habit of eating a cookie every afternoon. The first step is to identify the routine. For Duhigg, it was walking to the cafeteria, buying a cookie and eating it. The second and most critical step is to experiment with rewards. The goal here is to determine the actual craving. Is it hunger? A need for a sugar rush? A break from work? Social interaction? For a week, he tried a different routine to see if it would satisfy the craving. He found that an apple didn't quell the urge, but a walk or a conversation both did. The true reward he was seeking was temporary distraction and social connection. The third step is to isolate the cue. Habits are triggered by cues that generally fall into one of five categories: location, time, emotional state, other people, or the immediately preceding action. After several days of logging these variables, a clear pattern emerged. The urge consistently struck between 3 and 4 p.m. The cue wasn't hunger, it was the time of day. The fourth and final step is to have a plan. Applying the principles established throughout our discussion, the first step required a precise diagnosis of his own habits' underlying architecture. Duhigg could now implement the golden rule. He set an alarm for 3:30 p.m. When it went off, he got up and sought out a colleague for a 10-minute conversation. The craving was satisfied, the old routine was replaced, and the cookie-eating habit was broken. This systematic process demonstrates that change is not a matter of sheer willpower, but of methodical self-awareness.